For years, the most powerful move was silence. No interviews, no rebuttals, no public emotion. And then once, just once, that silence broke. Not with outrage, not with defensiveness, but with something far more final, a line drawn where patience used to be. This wasn't a snap reaction or a brother losing control. It was measured, deliberate, and unmistakably intentional. Prince William didn't speak to escalate a feud, he spoke to end a pattern. Because despite how it was framed in headlines, this moment was never really about Harry. It wasn't even about family dynamics. It was about something much larger, a system that had learned it could push, monetize, accuse, and repeat without consequence. A system that thrived on ambiguity, silence, and restraint. That system finally met a boundary. And once you see why this moment mattered, you'll understand why there's no way back. For years, Prince William mastered a form of restraint that most public figures never achieve. He absorbed speculation, criticism, and provocation without reply. When narratives targeted his leadership, questioned his marriage, or chipped at the monarchy's credibility, he chose absence over argument. That silence wasn't weakness, it was policy, which is exactly why this moment mattered. William didn't speak because pressure peaked or emotions overflowed. He spoke because the conditions had changed. This wasn't a reaction in real time. Palace officials confirmed the response had been drafted, reviewed, and refined long before December. What finally triggered its release wasn't anger, it was threshold. For years, personal grievances had been aired publicly and tolerated under the assumption that attention would fade. But over time, something shifted. Private disagreements stopped being described as personal experiences and started being framed as moral indictments. Silence, once interpreted as dignity, began to look like permission. The latest remarks didn't simply criticize the institution. They pulled a senior working royal into the narrative and recast restraint as cruelty. That moved the issue from opinion into reputational harm, from commentary into consequence. This is why the statement felt different. It wasn't defensive. It didn't rebut every claim. It didn't even name names. Instead, it clarified something far more important where tolerance ended. William wasn't correcting a story. He was closing a door. But what exactly crossed the line wasn't what most people think. This stopped being abstract the moment Catherine was pulled into it. For years, Catherine followed a rule so strict it often went unnoticed. She does not answer personal narratives with personal responses. No interviews, no background briefings, no anonymous corrections. Even when speculation circled her marriage, her role, or her silence during past controversies, she refused to engage. Not because she couldn't, but because she wouldn't. Within the palace, that silence was understood as doctrine, not avoidance. That's why the accusation landed so hard. When silence is reframed as moral failure, the meaning flips. What had long been viewed as institutional discipline was suddenly recast as complicity. And that shift wasn't accidental. By portraying Catherine's restraint as calculated indifference, the narrative did something precise. It personalized the conflict and forced a moral comparison. One woman as victim, the other as cold observer. Inside the palace, that move was seen as strategic. Catherine had absorbed years of pressure without response, protecting both herself and the institution by refusing to turn duty into content. To cast her as morally suspect for doing exactly that wasn't just unfair, it threatened to redefine the rules. If silence could now be weaponized, then no restraint was safe, no boundary was neutral. That's where William's calculation changed. This was no longer about differing perspectives or unresolved family tensions. It was about defending the principle that restraint is not guilt, that dignity is not cruelty, and that a working royal cannot be publicly indicted for following protocol while being denied the right to answer. At that point, silence stopped protecting the institution. And behind that response was something much bigger than family. The monarchy doesn't fear criticism, it fears precedent. Criticism is survivable. It comes and goes, shaped by headlines and public mood. But precedent changes behavior. And inside the palace, a quiet realization had been building for years. A rule was being broken without ever being named. The problem wasn't dissent, it was monetizing proximity. What began as personal reflection slowly evolved into something else. Private memories were repackaged as proof. Discomfort became grievance. Grievance became content. And content, once successful, demanded escalation. Each new project had to go further than the last, sharper claims, broader implications, higher moral stakes. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Stories about feeling misunderstood turned into accusations of mistreatment. Accusations hardened into claims of systemic failure. And eventually, the institution itself was cast as an antagonist, not flawed, but fundamentally unjust. For a time, silence worked. The palace believed disengagement would starve the cycle, that attention would burn out. But repetition changed the equation. When grievance is repeated often enough, it stops sounding like opinion and starts feeling like record. Silence, once interpreted as dignity, risked being read as agreement. That's when silence became dangerous, because allowing one figure to profit from royal association while publicly undermining royal legitimacy created a model others could follow. If unchecked, it normalized the idea that the monarchy could be endlessly repurposed as raw material, immune from response but never from use. That was the rule finally enforced: you cannot trade on the crown while dismantling it. And this is where Prince Harry's role became complicated. Harry wasn't built for the attention economy. From the beginning, Prince Harry lived under a level of scrutiny few people ever experience. Childhood grief played out in public. Rumors about his place in the family followed him for years. Every mistake was magnified, every vulnerability archived. That sensitivity wasn't manufactured, it was real, and it stayed with him into adulthood. But real pain doesn't always survive contact with the media machine unchanged. What started as lived trauma gradually became narrative fuel. Personal memories were revisited, reframed, and positioned to carry broader meaning. Moments that once existed privately were retold with structure, pacing, and moral framing. The shift wasn't necessarily malicious, it was adaptive. Platforms reward clarity. Stories need villains. Complexity doesn't trend. This is where the line between lived trauma and curated grievance began to blur. In the attention economy, reflection plateaus quickly. Relevance demands escalation. Each new appearance has to reveal something sharper than the last, introduce a new angle, or raise the stakes. Calm processing doesn't hold viewership. Conflict does. And when the subject matter is the monarchy, escalation naturally points outward from personal hurt to institutional blame. Inside the palace, this dynamic raised alarms. Harry wasn't operating in an environment designed for healing. He was operating in one that monetizes intensity, where visibility depends not on resolution, but repetition, not on closure, but continuation. That didn't make his experiences false, but it did make the trajectory predictable. And William recognized something unsettling. Once pain becomes product, it rarely stops on its own. And William saw something here that couldn't be undone. This wasn't about winning an argument. From William's perspective, debates can be weathered. Bad headlines fade. Public opinion shifts. What cannot be absorbed is a structural collision between two systems that operate by entirely different rules. The monarchy is built on continuity and trust. Its authority depends on stability, restraint, and the slow accumulation of legitimacy over time. It doesn't refresh itself through spectacle. It survives by appearing predictable, governed, and above the emotional churn of the moment. The modern media ecosystem works the opposite way. It rewards disruption, attention, and constant escalation. Visibility is currency. Relevance depends on conflict. Stories must sharpen or disappear. In that system, institutions aren't preserved, they're mined. For a time, those systems overlapped without open conflict. But overlap became dependency. Personal criticism of the monarchy turned into entertainment. Repetition normalized attack. And gradually, the idea took hold that the crown was fair game, an endlessly renewable source of content, unable to respond, but always available to be repurposed. That was the real threat William saw. If this dynamic continued unchecked, it would set a precedent that public attacks on the monarchy could be packaged, monetized, and rewarded without consequence. Not as dissent, but as entertainment. Silence in that context stopped being restraint and started becoming endorsement. William's response wasn't backward-looking. It wasn't about correcting past claims or settling family disputes. It was forward-looking. He was protecting the conditions under which the institution could still function in the next era. Draw the line now or let it dissolve completely. That decision wasn't personal, it was constitutional. But this line wasn't drawn alone. The king didn't speak, but he decided. King Charles III understood something crucial in this moment. His voice wasn't the instrument needed. Authority didn't require amplification. It required boundaries, quiet ones, final ones. Privately, 3 red lines were made unmistakably clear. First, the monarchy would not allow claims of institutional abuse to circulate endlessly without challenge or consequence. Allegations that strike at the legitimacy of the crown are not just personal opinions, they undermine the constitutional foundation itself. Silence in the face of that risk was no longer neutral. Second, senior working royals would not be left exposed, particularly those bound by protocol, from defending themselves publicly. Allowing character attacks to land on figures who cannot answer back was judged unacceptable. Protection in this context wasn't favoritism, it was duty. Third and most decisive, royal association could no longer be commercially leveraged without accountability. You could not reject the institution while profiting from its symbolism. Privacy could not coexist with monetized proximity. That contradiction had been tolerated too long. Charles did not deliver these lines himself for a reason. This moment wasn't about his reign, it was about continuity. By empowering William to speak, the king signaled trust in his heir's judgment and affirmed a transfer of operational authority already underway. The message wasn't reactive, it was generational. One voice, one statement, no escalation. That restraint was intentional. The king knew that public rebuttals invite endless reply. Delegation, by contrast, closes the loop. William's words carried finality precisely because they were authorized, not emotional. And then came the part no one expected. Silence became strategy. After the statement was released, many expected the usual cycle: clarifications, walkbacks, anonymous briefings, a second wave of commentary. None came. And that absence wasn't hesitation. It was design. The palace refused follow-ups because follow-ups extend the game. Every clarification becomes a prompt. Every rebuttal invites escalation. Instead, the response was singular and sealed. By not engaging again, the palace denied oxygen to the very mechanism that had sustained the conflict. No back and forth meant no momentum. No momentum meant no storyline to advance. The dispute was left without a stage. That posture stood in sharp contrast to the response from Meghan Markle's side. Carefully worded briefings emphasized hurt and disappointment, positioning her as emotionally wounded rather than confrontational. It was restraint, but tactical restraint. The aim wasn't closure. It was narrative preservation without provoking the boundary that had just been enforced. Inside the palace, the calculation was colder and simpler. Engagement would validate the framework. Silence would collapse it. There was another factor quietly shaping this decision: audience fatigue. Internal analysis showed diminishing returns on repetition. Each new reveal generated less shock, less urgency, less traction. The story was still loud but thinner. The palace understood something the platforms couldn't admit: escalation was no longer guaranteed to work. That asymmetry mattered. The palace loses nothing by waiting. Its relevance doesn't depend on clicks or cycles. The attention economy, by contrast, punishes stillness. Without response, pressure builds inward. So the palace held its line visibly unchanged. Schedules continued. Duties resumed. No drama, no reaction shots, no emotional cues for the audience to follow. And once the noise faded, something shifted. The exception quietly closed. For years, a gray zone existed that no one formally defined. Royal by association, independent by operation, critical by narrative. It was an arrangement built on ambiguity, and ambiguity served everyone until it didn't. The palace tolerated it because it hoped the moment would pass. That distance would cool tensions, that the overlap between institution and commentary would naturally resolve. Instead, the overlap hardened. Royal symbolism continued to carry value even as loyalty to the institution receded. Titles were rejected in function, but retained in effect. Privacy was claimed while proximity was sold. None of this violated a written rule because no such rule had ever been enforced. That's what changed. The palace didn't punish. It clarified. And that distinction matters. Ending the gray zone wasn't about retribution or humiliation. It was about definition. You cannot stand outside the institution while trading on its authority. You cannot reject the crown's obligations while benefiting from its recognition. Ambiguity, once protective, had become corrosive. When the line was finally drawn, something unexpected happened. Support didn't collapse. It stabilized. Opinions polarized, yes, but they stopped drifting. The monarchy no longer appeared reactive or defensive. It appeared governed. A fixed boundary gave the public something solid to agree with or oppose rather than an endless narrative to chase. Legitimacy didn't erode. It consolidated. That's the paradox of clarity. It ends confusion even when it creates disagreement. And for institutions, stability matters more than universal approval. By closing the exception, the palace closed a chapter that had lingered too long, not with spectacle, not with vengeance, but with a rule applied at last. Which leads to the real question. The cost of drawing lines is never abstract. A family fracture has hardened, and no amount of formal language can soften that reality. A brother stepped away. A door closed. The loss is personal, and it's permanent in ways no statement can repair. But this wasn't revenge. It was insulation. What Prince William chose wasn't emotional distance. It was structural protection. Catherine reinforced it through refusal rather than rebuttal, holding the center by declining to turn duty into spectacle. And King Charles III, by empowering his heir instead of intervening himself, signaled a generational reset already underway. Together, they drew a future-facing line: less sentimentality, more clarity. Less performance, more governance. A monarchy that survives not by winning narratives, but by refusing to compete in them. The price is human. The result is institutional. And that leaves one question hanging uncomfortable, unavoidable, and still unanswered. If a monarchy refuses to become content, what happens to those who built relevance by turning it into one?